My name is Julian Hayes. It's a name that for a time was synonymous with a certain kind of perfection, the kind you see on the covers of glossy magazines and whispered about in corner offices. August 17th, 2018 wasn't just another day on the calendar. It was the day the world I had meticulously constructed. The one built on foundations of steel, glass, and zeros in my bank account came crashing down. I used to think I had it all. The notion is a cliché, I know, but for me, it was a tangible, undeniable reality. I resided in a penthouse in downtown Vancouver, a glass sanctuary that hung in the sky like a jewel, offering an unobstructed view of the glittering water below. My mornings were a ritual of sipping artisanal coffee while watching seaplanes land and ferries glide across the inlet, all while contemplating my next billion-dollar move. I wasn't just a senior partner at a global financial firm. I was a titan, a force of nature. In the high-stakes world of mergers and acquisitions, I was celebrated for my audacity, and a portfolio so strong it could withstand a hurricane. My business dealings were chronicled in financial journals, and my net worth, once a secret, became public fodder, marking me not just as a millionaire but as a legitimate billionaire. The press dubbed me the Midas of the West Coast. My partner, Ryan, and I had been together for nearly a decade. To the outside world, we were the ultimate power couple, stylish, well-traveled. At the center of a social circle so exclusive it felt like its own nation. Our lives were a symphony of success, a carefully composed masterpiece of parties, galas, and expensive dinners. I was more than successful, I was a symbol. I'd graced the stages of LGBTQ+ panels, lauded as a trailblazer and a testament to what confidence and openness could achieve in the cutthroat business world. I was a spokesperson for a movement, a living, breathing billboard for the idea that identity and success were intertwined, and that one's truth was a path to unshakable power. But underneath that meticulously crafted image, there was a void. A hollow space I kept pushing down, burying it under work, travel, and the roar of public applause. It was a spiritual emptiness, a flicker of something ancient and true that I had long abandoned, dismissed as a fairy tale for the weak. My mother, a quiet, gentle soul from the prairies, was the only one who saw through the facade. She would call every so often, her voice a soft, steady whisper in my loud, chaotic life. And she'd always end with the same 6 words that I had come to both dread and secretly cling to. I just want you to know that God loves you, Julian. I'd roll my eyes, a gesture she couldn't see, and offer a polite thank you, convinced she was still clinging to old-fashioned guilt and outdated beliefs. I felt a sense of pity for her, a woman so tethered to a fading narrative in a world that had moved on. Then one Friday afternoon, the carefully balanced scales of my life tipped violently. I was packing the glass-walled halls of our office, the city a dizzying panorama below me. We were on the verge of closing a deal that had been a grueling 6-month-long grind. I hadn't slept well in weeks, the tight pain in my chest a constant, uninvited companion. I had convinced myself it was just anxiety, or maybe the excessive espresso shots I had been downing like water. I remember stepping into the main boardroom, the polished oak table reflecting the sterile fluorescent lights. I opened my laptop, the screen a glowing rectangle of numbers and charts, and that's when it hit me. Not like a wave, but like a sharp, crushing weight pressing down on my sternum. The room tilted. My vision blurred into a kaleidoscope of colors. I heard a voice, my own, calling for help before everything went black. That was the moment I died. Clinically, they said my heart stopped for a little over 7 minutes. But what I saw during that time, it was more real than anything I had ever experienced in my life. It was a reality that dwarfed my billion-dollar empire. The world didn't just go black, it shattered into a million fragments of panic, sound, and light. At first, I was floating. The sensation was not one of falling or rising, but of a complete and utter weightlessness, a severance from the laws of physics that had governed my entire life. Below me, I saw my own body, an inert sack of flesh slumped over the boardroom table. My assistant was screaming, a high-pitched, desperate sound that cut through the sterile air. A junior partner, his face a mask of terror, fumbled with his phone, begging for an ambulance. I watched them, a scene of raw human panic unfolding in slow motion, yet I felt nothing. No pain, no fear, no connection to the vessel they were trying so desperately to save. It was an eerie, profound calm, like watching a dramatic play from the safety of a balcony. And then I was no longer an observer. A current, deeper and more powerful than anything in the known universe, began to pull at me. It wasn't a physical force, but a spiritual one, drawing me away from the chaos of the boardroom, out of the high-rise, and beyond the boundaries of this world. The transition was not a tunnel of light, as the stories often claim. It was far more complex, far more alive. It felt like being pulled through layers of a cosmic tapestry, sheets of living color and emotion that shifted and swirled around me. These weren't static images, they were vibrant, pulsating, filled with the very essence of joy and sorrow, love and loss. Each layer I passed through was a new revelation, a different emotional truth. As I moved deeper, the layers began to merge. My existence wasn't a linear progression anymore. It was a simultaneous experience of past, present, and future. I wasn't just watching my life, I was feeling it. Every conversation, every decision, every fleeting thought was relived with a searing clarity. I felt the warmth of my first love, the pride of my first major deal, the sting of a careless word I had spoken to a friend years ago. But the most shocking revelation was that I was no longer confined to my own perspective. It was like an instant, total download of empathy. I felt the loneliness of my partner, Ryan, every time I chose to work late instead of coming home to him. I felt the disappointment and hurt in his eyes that he had hidden so well behind his charming smile. I felt the quiet, piercing ache in my mother's heart when I dismissed her faith as superstition. The casual cruelty of my words striking her like a physical blow. I felt the fleeting admiration of a young intern I had barely noticed. The profound respect she had for my confidence, and the quiet awe she held for me, hoping to one day be just as successful. I felt the stinging shame of those I had belittled during a meeting, dismissing their ideas with a sharp, arrogant laugh. It wasn't about what I had done, it was about the ripple effect of my actions. Every moment mattered. Every choice, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, echoed an eternity. A truth so simple yet so terrifyingly profound. As I was pulled deeper, the emotions grew heavier, more vivid. I had expected to find a sense of peace, a quiet bliss like the kind you read about in spiritual books. Instead, I found a kind of reckoning. It wasn't a judgment in the way humans conceive of it, no wagging finger or angry voice, but something far more powerful. It was the pure, unfiltered truth being laid bare. There were no excuses here. No hiding behind my success or my pain or the carefully constructed narrative of my past. It was just everything. All of it laid bare in the open, and it wasn't cruel in its revelation. It was brutally, honestly transparent. I felt exposed in a way I never had before. Stripped not of my clothes, but of my ego, my pride, and the self-deception that had been my constant companion. In that space, a place beyond time and human understanding, I realized for the first time just how far I had drifted. Not just from the God my mother had always spoken of, but from the man I was supposed to be. I had spent so much time being who the world wanted me to be, I had forgotten who I truly was. As I was pulled deeper into this living, emotional kaleidoscope, the visions became more vivid, more piercing. I relived moments I had long forgotten. Scenes from my life playing out like a three-dimensional movie, but with a horrifying twist. I wasn't watching them, I was feeling them. Not just from my perspective, but from the perspective of everyone I had ever interacted with. It was an involuntary, full-sensory replay of every lie, every truth, every kindness, and every cruelty I had ever inflicted. I felt the sharp ache in my mother's heart when I had laughed off her prayers as superstition. The casual dismissal of my words echoing in her spirit like a betrayal. I felt Ryan's loneliness every time I canceled a dinner for a last-minute business trip. The quiet sadness in his eyes that I had always been too busy or too self-absorbed to notice. I felt the disappointment of the young intern I had once belittled. His bright-eyed ambition turning to a quiet despair after I had dismissed his ideas as naive. The ripple effect wasn't just a metaphor. It was a cosmic law, and I was seeing its devastating consequences in real time. The emotions grew heavier, more and more suffocating. I had expected to find peace, perhaps even bliss in this journey. But what I found was a kind of spiritual reckoning. It wasn't a judgment in the way people often think of it, like someone wagging a finger at you. It was more like an undeniable, pure, unfiltered truth being laid bare. There were no excuses, no hiding behind my success or my past or the trauma I had endured. It was just everything. All of it out in the open. And it wasn't cruel. It was honest, painfully, searingly honest. I felt exposed in a way I never had before. In that space, I realized for the first time how far I had drifted, not just from my spiritual roots, but from the person I was created to be. I was a man who had conquered the world, yet I was utterly lost in a universe that was far grander and more real than my own. The journey into my past had been a storm of emotions, but as I was pulled deeper, the weight of the reckoning intensified, becoming almost unbearable. I had spent my life building a fortress of success and image, a meticulously crafted persona designed to deflect criticism and inspire envy. But here, in this place of living truth, every brick of that fortress was being dismantled. I wasn't being judged by an external force. I was being judged by the pure, unfiltered, and honest truth of my own being, a mirror held up to my soul that showed me not what I wanted to see, but what was real. It wasn't a finger-wagging, fire and brimstone kind of judgment. It was a searing, relentless honesty that made every excuse I had ever clung to feel like a flimsy shield made of tissue paper. There was no hiding. My billion-dollar empire, my public persona, my carefully curated social media, all of it meant nothing here. It was a currency that held no value, a costume that had been stripped away. The raw, aching feeling of my own choices, my own selfishness, and my own pride was laid bare. I felt the casual dismissiveness I had shown to my mother, the intellectual arrogance with which I had brushed off her prayers, and the profound pain her heart felt every time I rolled my eyes at her faith. I felt the emptiness I had cultivated in my relationship with Ryan, prioritizing work and social status over intimacy and genuine connection. I had convinced myself that our shared success was enough. But in this space, I felt the hollowness of a bond built on convenience and image rather than on love. The realization was a punch to the gut. I had spent my entire life running, not from a problem but from myself. I had a purpose, a calling that was written on my soul, and I had spent every waking moment writing over it with a different story, one of my own making. A story of worldly success, of accolades, of a public identity that I had come to idolize. I had lived a life that the world applauded, but in that moment, in that space, I knew that applause was just a deafening lie. Here in the quiet, piercing honesty of eternity, it meant nothing. I had been celebrated for being someone I was not, and that deception was the true source of my pain. I was exposed in a way I never had been before. Stripped not of my clothes, but of my ego, my pride, and the self-deception that had been my constant companion. Here in the pure, unfiltered light, I realized for the first time just how far I had drifted. Not just from faith, but from the authentic, vulnerable person I was supposed to be. Then came the moment that shattered every last shred of my understanding of reality. I didn't see him the way you see a person walk into a room. My eyes were the last sense to register his arrival. I felt him first, like the very fabric of existence held its breath. The layers of living color around me stilled, the swirling emotions became silent. And a profound, weighty stillness fell over everything. It was as if the universe itself knew he was coming and paused in reverence. He didn't emerge from the light, he was the light and he was there. I didn't need to be told who he was. Every fiber of my being, every cell, every molecule, recognized him with a certainty that went beyond logic or faith. I just knew. This was not the version of Jesus you see in stained glass windows or the gentle figure in old paintings. He was brighter than any light I had ever seen, yet not blinding. He was not a man of gentle smiles, but a presence of absolute living truth. There was a kind of fire in his being, not the heat of an earthly flame, but something deeper. A truth so alive it felt like it could see through every pretense, every lie, and every wall I had ever built. My entire life I had been the one in control, the one who held all the cards. The one who saw through other people's facades. But in his presence I was the one laid bare, seen completely and irrevocably. I was terrified. The sheer power and holiness of his presence were enough to make me want to dissolve into nothingness. I wanted to fall to my knees and hide, to disappear from his gaze. And yet, in the very same moment, I had never felt more safe in my entire life. The love emanating from him was a tangible force, a perfect balm to the terror. It was a love that didn't just accept me, it knew me. Every flaw, every sin, every secret shame, and it loved me anyway. The paradox of it all was dizzying. To be so exposed, so seen, so utterly vulnerable, and to be met not with condemnation, but with a sorrow so deep it made my chest ache. His love wasn't a soft affection, it was a consuming fire. a painful and beautiful truth that was setting me on fire from the inside out. He didn't speak with words. There was no audible voice, but he spoke to me directly, his thoughts filling my entire being with a clarity that was impossible to misunderstand. And what he showed me, what he revealed, broke me into a million pieces. He showed me people, not in a book or on a screen, but as if their very souls were held up before me. Faces, souls. Some of them I recognized instantly. People I had known. People I had partied with in exclusive clubs in London and New York. People I had shared drinks with at star-studded galas. They were brilliant, charismatic, celebrated. I saw an influential tech mogul who had been lauded for his bold speeches on radical self-acceptance. I saw a social media star who had millions of followers and a message of living your truth. I saw activists I had admired, leaders I had looked up to, bold and proud and seemingly unshakable in their confidence. He showed me what had become of them. And it wasn't peace, it wasn't heaven. They were in a darkness so profound it wasn't just the absence of light. It was a deep, aching spiritual blackness that pressed in on all sides. I didn't see pitchforks or mythical red devils. What I saw was far worse. I saw sorrow, regret, and an isolation that screamed louder than any physical torture could. Their torment was not the physical agony of fire, but the spiritual horror of being completely alone. Knowing the truth but too late to act on it. It was the crushing weight of their own choices. The message wasn't about their identities. It wasn't about who they loved or how they lived their lives in that respect. It was deeper than that. They were there because they had embraced a version of life that felt good, that was celebrated by the world. That looked like freedom but was actually a lie, a counterfeit of something holy and true. They had rejected the very truth that was now consuming them with regret. They had traded in the real for the imitation, and in this place the difference was a chasm of unbearable torment. I saw the tech mogul, his face now a mask of profound sorrow, his eyes hollowed out by the weight of a truth he had spent his life denying. The social media star, once so vibrant and loud, was now curled in on himself, clutching at a phantom audience that was no longer there. His screams were silent, a sound that only his soul could hear. Jesus turned his gaze toward me and I couldn't bear it. But there was no anger in him, only a sorrow so deep it made my chest ache. He didn't need to speak. His sorrow said it all. He turned his gaze toward me, and in his eyes I saw my entire life replayed not as I remembered it but through his lens. I saw my pride, an arrogant, self-serving force that I had mistaken for confidence. I saw my choices, the endless cascade of decisions that had been based on a desire for more money, more power, more applause. I saw the people I had influenced, the ones who had looked up to me as a symbol of success and identity. I had lived as an icon, a trailblazer in the LGBTQ+ world, celebrated for my ability to seamlessly merge my identity with my astronomical success. I had given speeches about empowerment and freedom, and I had truly believed I was leading people toward the light. But through his eyes, I saw how many had followed in my footsteps thinking they were walking into truth, when in fact they were walking away from it, deeper into the very spiritual darkness I had just witnessed. I saw the young men and women who had watched my interviews, who had read articles about my opulent life, and had come to believe that my kind of freedom, the freedom from divine truth, was the ultimate goal. I saw the ripple effect of my life, a destructive tide spreading out from every word I had spoken, every deal I had closed, every public appearance I had made. My story, my polished image, my silence in the face of the truth I was too proud to admit I was running from. All of it had shaped others' destinies. The weight of that knowledge was a physical, crushing force. My achievements felt like a house of cards built on a foundation of sand. And I saw the destructive winds of my influence blowing them all down. I didn't mean to lead anyone astray. I truly didn't. I had been living a lie, but it was my lie. And I hadn't realized how many others were buying into it. But that didn't change the fact that I had. Jesus didn't accuse me. He didn't point a finger or say a single word of condemnation. But I felt it anyway, a conviction so heavy it could have crushed me. A spiritual weight that made the pressure of a boardroom collapse feel like a feather in comparison. It was a knowing, an understanding of the immense spiritual damage I had caused. And it was a pain far greater than any I had ever known. He then brought me to a place I can only describe as a spiritual courtroom. But it was nothing like the courtrooms of the human world. There were no walls, no judges, no gavel to bring down a verdict. There was only light, a brilliant, consuming light that revealed everything. I stood in the middle of this open, endless space, and suddenly, scenes from my life began to unfold all around me, not as memories, but as a living, panoramic map. Every decision, every word, every unspoken thought was laid out for me to see. I watched as moments I had long forgotten returned with a piercing, brutal clarity. The scene with my mother, the words I had casually tossed aside like worthless coins, now replayed with the weight of her love and the spiritual pain my dismissal had caused. I saw a moment with Ryan when I had brushed off his fears about the growing distance between us. My voice tight with impatience as I called him too sensitive. I watched as his face, once so full of light, clouded over with a familiar sadness. I saw another scene a few years back when a bright young intern, also gay, had come to me for advice. He was struggling with the pressure to fit into a certain mold. And I, in my self-proclaimed wisdom, had encouraged him to live boldly, to embrace the narrative the world had written for him. My words had been a performance, a well-rehearsed speech. But in this place, I felt the sharp sting of my own hypocrisy. Deep down, I knew I hadn't found peace on that path myself. I had simply built a gilded cage and convinced myself it was a palace. Every single moment played back, not to shame me, but to show me. To show me what I had become, a man who had traded his soul for a facade of power and success. To show me what I could have been, a man of integrity, authenticity, and light. The disconnect between my public persona as a billionaire and the private, hollow man I had become was laid bare. I had been so busy chasing the world's version of me that I had lost sight of the person I was created to be. Then, as the scenes from my life faded, Jesus showed me a book. It was not a book made of paper and ink, but a living, glowing entity, pulsing with a light that I recognized from his presence. He opened it, and at the top of the page, my name was written in a script that seemed to be made of starlight. Julian Hayes. The words below it began to shimmer, then fade before my eyes, as if being erased by an invisible hand. A wave of raw, animal panic washed over me. I watched my destiny dissolve. I didn't have a mouth to speak with, but my entire being screamed a question. Why is it disappearing? And the response wasn't spoken in words, but it filled my entire being with an undeniable, crushing truth. Because your choices are erasing the story I wrote for you. That truth hit me harder than death itself. I had spent my life as a master of my own narrative, the billionaire who had written his own success story. But in that moment, I saw the shocking, soul-shattering reality that God had written a story for me. A calling, a purpose that was both grander and more beautiful than anything I had ever conceived. And I had spent my entire life, not with evil or with malice, but with pride. With comfort and with lies I had accepted as truth, writing over it. I had been so busy chasing the applause of the world that I had deafened myself to the quiet, profound purpose of heaven. The world's approval, the headlines, the accolades, the net worth, it was all a thunderous noise down on earth, but here it meant nothing. My story was not my own, it was a forgery. And in my desperate attempt to be a god unto myself, I had not only erased the path to my true purpose, but I had led others down a path I never intended for them. Then came the moment I will never, ever be able to scrub from my memory. Jesus took me to a place of unbearable torment. This was not the hell of storybooks, with flames licking at people's skin or devils with pitchforks. This was far, far worse. This was the agony of truth fully known but too late to act on. I saw souls crying out, screaming, their hands reaching into a void for a light they had once known but had pushed away. Their torment was an isolation so profound it was a physical force. A crushing emptiness that screamed louder than any pain I could ever imagine. The sound of their cries was hollow, echoing into an endless silence. One of them I recognized. His name was Andre. He had been a speaker at one of the LGBTQ+ conferences I had attended in Toronto. He was funny, confident, and brilliant, a mesmerizing force on stage. We had shared a panel together about living your truth, a phrase that now felt like a curse. I remembered him laughing, commanding the stage, the audience in the palm of his hand. But here in this place he was curled in on himself, clutching at the empty air. Silent tears streaming down a face that could no longer hide behind the applause that had once defined him. He wasn't screaming. He was whispering, a sound more terrifying than any shout. I didn't know. He kept repeating it over and over, his voice a broken plea. I didn't know it was real. The sound of that whisper will stay with me forever, a haunting melody of regret and hopelessness. It was the sound of a man who had been celebrated for living a lie, only to find out when it was too late that the truth he had rejected was the only thing that could have saved him. Jesus turned to me and I felt his heart break again. The silent, sorrowful explanation from Jesus filled my soul. He showed me that these people, these souls I had just witnessed, weren't condemned because of their identity or their worldly choices. The message was far more profound. They were there because they had followed their own will over his. They had embraced a counterfeit purpose, built on fleeting applause and the approval of men. And they had rejected the truth that was waiting for them all along. Their choices, their messages, their lives had led others down a path that was never intended for them. And though he had called them over and over through whispers in the silence, through the persistent prayers of their mothers, through the quiet void they felt even in the height of their worldly success, they had never turned back. I wept. I couldn't stop. The tears streamed down my face, not just for Andre and the others, but for myself. For the generations of people who are being told that love and truth are whatever we want them to be. I wept for a world that preaches that there are no consequences for our choices. That identity is a fluid concept with no anchor, and that purpose doesn't truly matter. I had lived that lie my entire life, chasing a future of power and wealth while neglecting the one thing that mattered. In that moment, in that place of sorrow and truth, I saw with piercing clarity that it all mattered. Every step, every word, every influence we have on another person, it all echoes in eternity. I had spent my life calculating risk and reward in the financial world. But I had been blind to the spiritual calculus. I had never considered the eternal consequence of a casual remark, a proud article, or a silent endorsement. The sorrow of that truth was a cold, aching weight, heavier than any I had ever carried. And yet there was a glimmer of hope. After that harrowing vision, I was taken to see what could have been. After that gut-wrenching vision, Jesus showed me two paths. It wasn't just about what I had done wrong, it was about the life I was truly meant to live. The first path was a grim reflection of my current reality. In this vision, I kept living the way I had been. I stayed with Ryan. We grew older together, our lives a predictable, luxurious dance of high society events and international travel. My net worth continued to climb, the zeros in my bank account piling higher and higher. My fame in business circles growing into something truly monumental. I even saw myself writing a memoir, a glossy bestseller about my life as a trailblazing billionaire icon. But in this version of my life, I was spiritually hollow. The light in my eyes faded, replaced by a cold, calculating gaze. My smile, the one that had charmed clients and captivated audiences, was there, but it was mechanical, a reflex with no joy behind it. I was surrounded by people, a vast network of connections and associates. Yet I was completely alone inside. The gilded cage I had built for myself was beautiful on the outside, but it was a prison. I had everything the world could offer, but I had nothing that mattered. The spiritual hunger I had felt in life had become a gnawing emptiness that no amount of success could fill. I saw the end of that path. I died not in a sudden, dramatic moment, but peacefully in my sleep, a rich and celebrated man. But in that vision, I saw my soul drift away from God. It wasn't a dramatic descent into a fiery abyss. It was a cold, quiet, irreversible distance, like a ship pulling away from a shore. The connection fraying and finally snapping in the vast, empty blackness. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to my core that this was the default path I had been on. The one I had been sprinting down my entire life. Then, as the coldness of that first path faded, he showed me the other one. This one didn't start with a bang of success or a roar of applause. It started with rejection. The vision began with me walking away from everything I had built. I saw myself handing in my resignation, my partner at the firm staring at me with a mix of disbelief and pity. I saw the silence from my old friends, the abrupt end to invitations. The whispers that followed me as I gave up my reputation as a billionaire icon. It hurt deeply. The emotional pain of walking away from the life I had so desperately constructed, and the people I had shared it with was a tangible, aching weight in my soul. I saw the heartbroken look on Ryan's face as I ended our relationship. The decade of our shared life ending not with a fight, but with a quiet admission of a truth he couldn't understand. But then, as I watched this difficult path unfold, something miraculous began to happen. I saw people coming to me not drawn by my fame or my wealth, but by the quiet truth in my story. They were people who had been in the same place I once was. Young men and women searching for a peace they couldn't find in the world's version of identity and freedom. I saw myself speaking to them, not from a stage of pride, but from a place of humility. My voice steady, my words filled with a quiet power. I was different. The change was physical as well as spiritual. The stressed lines around my eyes were gone. I looked free. My posture, once rigid with the weight of expectation, was now relaxed. My eyes, which had been hollow and cold in the first vision, were bright again, full of a light that was not my own. I was finally living the life I was created for. It was a life not without pain, for the loss was real. But it was a life full of a profound and unshakable peace, a peace that was not dependent on my circumstances or my bank account. Jesus looked at me, and his silent voice filled my being with a choice. Jesus looked at me, his gaze full of the same sorrow and love I had felt before. And his spirit said to mine, "This is still possible, but the choice is yours." He didn't coerce me. He didn't threaten me. He simply offered me the two futures I had just seen and left the decision to me. The choice was a million times clearer than any financial decision I had ever made in a boardroom. The choice was not about what I had to gain, but what I had to lose. And in that moment, all the billions in my bank account, all the fame and influence, all the relationships built on a false foundation, none of it meant anything to me. I was willing to give it all up. Right there in that endless space, I made my choice. With everything in me, with the very core of my being, I didn't just ask, I begged him. I begged him to give me another chance, to send me back, to let me live differently. I wanted that second path. I didn't care what I had to lose. I was ready to let go of every worldly possession, every shred of my carefully constructed identity. Everything I had once held dear. I just wanted to be who he had made me to be. Before the world and my own pride had rewritten my story. As the words of my desperate plea echoed through that spiritual space, I felt his hand over my heart. It wasn't a physical touch, but a spiritual one, a presence so real and so warm that it felt like every molecule in my being was being realigned. A warmth spread through me, not just physically but spiritually. A fire that began to burn away the layers of pretense and hollowness that had consumed my soul. It was the warmth of forgiveness, of a second chance. It was the feeling of a debt being paid, a weight being lifted. And then, as the warmth continued to spread and grow, everything around me began to fade. The living colors, the visions, the profound presence of Jesus, it all began to dissolve. As if I was being pulled backward through a cosmic current, back to where it all began. The colors, the visions, the presence, it all began to spiral and fade, pulling me backward as if I were a kite on a string being reeled back to earth. I was pulled back to my body, back to the world I had so recently left behind. And in that final, rapid-fire descent, I heard just one more thing, a command that felt like a spiritual tattoo on my soul before my eyes opened again. It wasn't a whisper. It was a roar that filled the universe. Tell them everything you saw. My eyes snapped open. I was surrounded by machines, their beeping monitors a jarring, alien symphony after the profound silence I had just experienced. The harsh sting of an IV was in my arm and a tube was down my throat. My chest hurt like it had been crushed, a deep, physical ache that was a brutal reminder of my return to a body of flesh and bone. But despite the pain, I was alive. Not just breathing, but truly, profoundly alive for the first time. Ryan was there holding my hand, his face pale, tears in his eyes. The doctor came in, his voice a dispassionate drone explaining the mechanics of my survival. He said I had died for 7 minutes and 31 seconds. They called it a miracle that I was still breathing, that there was no brain damage. But they didn't know the full story. They couldn't. They didn't know that I hadn't just come back from clinical death. I had come back from the edge of eternity, a place where $1 billion was nothing and a single tear of regret was everything. I had come back with a sacred trust. And everything in me, every fiber of my being, knew that I wouldn't stay silent. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. My body was healing, the bruised feeling in my chest slowly receding, but my spirit was already sprinting. I lay in that hospital bed, surrounded by the sterile, antiseptic smell, feeling like a phantom in my own skin. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't sit still. Everything felt different, like I had woken up in a world that wasn't quite real anymore. The billion-dollar deals, the socialite galas, the polished halls of my firm, they all seemed like faded photographs from a life I no longer inhabited. My mind, which had always been a fortress of logic and data, was now filled with the profound, overwhelming reality of what I had seen. I kept seeing their faces, those souls I had witnessed in that place of torment. I saw Andre's broken whisper, his haunted eyes. I heard their silent cries, felt the cold, crushing weight of their hopelessness. I couldn't shake the weight of the responsibility Jesus had laid on me. Tell them, that's all I kept hearing. Over and over again. It wasn't a suggestion, it was a divine directive, a sacred trust burned into my soul. I had spent my entire life as a master of words, of influence, of crafting a narrative for profit and prestige. Now my purpose was to tell a story that could not be bought or sold, a truth that would likely cost me everything I had once valued. I knew I couldn't go back to the life I had so desperately clung to. My old life had been a mirage, and the desert was waiting for those who followed it. When Ryan visited me again, the sterile hospital room was filled with an unbearable tension. I knew I had to be honest. There was no other way. I took his hand, my grip feeling alien and foreign. I looked into his eyes and saw the man I had lived with for a decade, the one who had shared in my triumphs and witnessed my relentless drive. And then I told him everything, every single detail. From the moment I left my body in the boardroom to the moment I saw Jesus, and every harrowing vision in between. I told him what I saw about us, about the life we were living, about the gilded emptiness that had been slowly consuming our souls. I explained to him that it wasn't just about sin or being wrong. It was about being separated from the one who made us, about living a lie so convincingly that we believed it ourselves. Ryan stared at me, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. It was as if he was looking at a complete stranger wearing the body of the man he loved. The silence that fell between us for the first time in 10 years was not comfortable. It was a chasm, a deafening spiritual void that had just opened up between us. A stark contrast to the perfect life we had so carefully curated. When I finished speaking, he stood up slowly, the movement a stark physical distance from me. He shook his head, a single, sorrowful gesture. "Julian," he said, his voice quiet, almost pleading. "Maybe this was just some kind of trauma, a hallucination, a dream. You were gone for a long time." I nodded, not out of agreement, but because I understood. How could I expect him to believe it? Before that day, I wouldn't have believed it myself. I was the master of my own universe, a billionaire who dealt in cold, hard facts and tangible assets. I had dismissed people like my mother and their faith as quaint and naive. How could I ask the man who loved me for my ambition and my power to believe in a spiritual reality that had shattered all of my own? The chasm between us was now a canyon, and there was no way to cross it. Within 2 weeks of leaving the hospital, I made a decision that shocked everyone. The moment I was physically able, I acted on the spiritual urgency that had been burning inside me. I resigned from my position at the firm. My senior partners, the people I had built a legacy with, thought I had lost my mind. They offered me a leave of absence, a consulting role, anything to keep me from walking away from the staggering fortune I was due in future bonuses. I politely declined all of it. I walked away from billions without a second thought. I deleted my social media, the curated world of my public life, my brand, my influence, gone with a few clicks. And I moved out of the high-rise apartment Ryan and I had shared, leaving the perfect life behind. The press, of course, tried to make sense of it all. It was a feeding frenzy. Headlines screamed about the sudden, shocking downfall of a titan. Some outlets speculated that I'd had a mental breakdown. Others claimed I had been targeted by some clandestine religious group and subjected to a kind of psychological coercion. The most popular headline, the one that seemed to stick, called me the former LGBTQ plus icon turned religious extremist. I didn't respond to any of them. I wasn't angry. The noise of the world, the opinions of others, the frantic attempts to label and understand my decision, it all sounded like static. I just knew this was a cost. The price was everything I had once valued, everything I had spent a lifetime building. But Jesus had shown me the truth, and I knew with a certainty that transcended all logic that I couldn't go back. Not even a little bit. No paycheck, no relationship, no applause, no public image was worth losing eternity. The applause I had chased for so long was a lie, a deafening sound that had drowned out the quiet truth I now cherished. But here is the part that really broke me in both pain and beauty. As word of my breakdown got out, something unexpected began to happen. It was a slow, quiet trickle at first, but it quickly became a flood. People began reaching out to me, not through public channels, but quietly, privately. Messages started showing up in my inbox from young men I had met at exclusive LGBTQ galas. From powerful women in business I had mentored, from teenagers who had followed my life from afar. Their messages weren't angry. They were curious, they were scared. They weren't calling me a traitor. They were confessing their own emptiness. Some of them said things like, "I felt empty too, but I never thought someone like you with everything would ever admit it." Others who had been raised in faith and had left said, "I've always believed in God, but I didn't know if He still wanted me after the life I've lived." And then there was one message from a young man from Montreal that stopped me cold. He wrote, "I was going to end my life until I saw your story. Now I'm trying church for the first time." That's when it hit me. That's when I knew with every fiber of my being that Jesus hadn't just brought me back to save me. He had brought me back to help save others too. My public disgrace was His divine appointment. The very story that the world had condemned was the key that was unlocking hearts that had been closed to any other message. A few months later, I started something small. So small it felt almost inconsequential compared to the multi-billion-dollar deals I used to orchestrate. Just a weekly Bible study at a friend's house, held in a cozy living room with a beat-up sofa and a coffee table littered with mismatched mugs. There were no big signs, no public announcements, no agenda to get anyone to believe anything. It was just a quiet, safe place for people like me. People who had lived a certain way for so long, celebrated by the world. Yet deep down were still hungry for something real. At first, it was just the three of us. Then the next week, word spread and we were 6. Then 12. It grew faster and more organically than any financial portfolio I had ever built. The craziest part was that most of them weren't coming because of me, the former billionaire. They were coming because of what I had seen. They weren't after religion. They were desperate to understand what eternity actually looked like, what truth really meant. My story, my testimony, had become a spiritual anchor for those who felt adrift. And that opened the door for me to share everything again, the entire terrifying, beautiful journey. Over and over with every new soul that walked through that door. Every single time I told my story, whether it was to 3 people or 30. I felt that same familiar tremble in my chest that I had felt when I stood in the presence of Jesus. It was a physical reminder of the weight and the glory of what I had seen. There was one night I'll never forget. A young guy, probably 19 or 20, came up to me after I finished speaking. His eyes were red-rimmed, his voice shaking with a raw vulnerability that broke my heart. "I'm gay," he said, the words a quiet confession. "And I don't know who I am, I don't know what to believe." But then his eyes, though full of tears, found a flicker of hope. "After hearing what you saw," he continued, "I think I want to find out what God says about me." I put my hands on his shoulders, feeling the trembling in his body. And I looked at him with the same sorrow and love that I had seen in Jesus' eyes. "He's not ashamed of you," I told him, my voice steady. "But he wants you to know the truth. And it's not a truth the world will tell you because the world profits from you believing the lie." That night, right there in that living room, that young man gave his life to Jesus. Not because I had told him he had to change. Not because I had given him a new list of rules to follow. But because he saw through the lens of my story that love and truth can't exist apart from each other. That you can't have one without the other. He saw a way out of the emptiness and he took it. That moment, that kid, I would go through everything all over again just for that. It's been 5 years now. The world has moved on from the scandalous headlines about the billionaire who walked away from it all. I live in a quiet neighborhood in the suburbs, not far from where I grew up. The high-rise overlooking the water has been replaced by a house with a small yard. I don't have billions in the bank anymore. My custom-tailored suits, once a symbol of my power, have been traded for worn denim and comfortable hoodies, but I have never been more rich. The peace I feel now, the quiet joy, is a currency that the world cannot offer and cannot take away. I spend my time speaking in churches, schools, and sometimes even in places that don't believe in God at all. My old life had me speaking from stages to audiences of CEOs and politicians. Now I have coffee with drag queens, dinners with CEOs, and deep conversations with people who once hated me for leaving the movement. I've met with former colleagues who once dismissed me as crazy, and with young people who are just starting their own search for meaning. But I don't show up with anger. I show up with the same sorrow and love that Jesus had in his eyes when he looked at me. I show up with truth because that's what saved me. I'll be honest, there are still nights where I wake up shaking. The memory of that place of torment is seared into my soul. Sometimes in the middle of a quiet night, I hear those silent screams again. Sometimes I see Andre's face, his eyes hollowed out by a truth known too late. I remember the profound, aching torment, the silence that followed their cries, the crushing weight of knowing they didn't turn back in time. The spiritual and emotional reality of what I saw is a constant companion. And every time I feel that ache, every time that memory returns, I get back on my knees and pray. Not just for strength, but for them. For the people still living the way I was, so full of pride and comfort and worldly success, yet so spiritually empty. For the ones who think this life, with its fleeting applause and temporary pleasures, is all there is. For the ones who are believing the lie that truth is relative and that eternity is just a concept. I pray for them to wake up, to feel that divine nudge in the middle of their perfect lives, and to choose the truth before it's too late. If you're one of them, if you've made it this far into my story, still listening right now, I don't think it's an accident. I believe with all my heart that God wanted you to hear this. Maybe it's because you've been questioning things lately, looking at the life you've built and wondering if there's more to it. Maybe it's because you've been feeling that gnawing emptiness I once felt but couldn't explain. A void that no amount of success, applause, or affirmation could ever fill. Maybe it's because deep down, you know the life you're living doesn't line up with the peace you're hoping for. I'm not here to shame you. I'm not here to scare you. I'm not here to tell you what to believe. I'm just a man who died and came back, a man who saw what was real, and I'm here to tell you what I saw. I'm here to say that Jesus is real. Hell is real. Heaven is real. And your choices, every single one of them, matter more than you could ever imagine. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. You don't have to be perfect to come to God. I wasn't. When I stood before Jesus, I didn't have all the answers. I didn't even know what to say. But he looked at me and loved me anyway. And that love, that unearned, unconditional grace, changed me from the inside out. He didn't just rescue me from the torment I saw. He rescued me from the lie that I had to be my own God, my own authority, and the only one writing the story of my life. That freedom, the freedom from having to prove myself, to perform, to succeed at all costs. That's what I want for you. It's the kind of real freedom the world can't even begin to offer. If you're watching this and you're in the LGBTQ+ community, or you struggle with your identity, or you've been hurt by religious people who spoke more hate than love, I see you. I know what that feels like. I've been there. But let me be honest with you, being affirmed by people doesn't mean you're in alignment with God. I was affirmed for years. I was celebrated as a trailblazer. I was called a symbol of freedom. And none of it saved me. But when Jesus called me, when he showed me the truth, I knew I had to choose. And you have to choose too. No matter what the world tells you, truth doesn't change. And it's waiting for you. So here's my invitation. If something in your heart is stirred right now, don't ignore it. Pray, talk to God. Ask him to reveal himself to you like he did for me. If you don't know what to say, just start with this. Jesus, I don't know where to go from here, but I want to know what's real. Show me the truth. That's enough. He'll meet you there. And if you already know him but you've been living far from him, it's time to come home. Don't wait. Don't bet your eternity on tomorrow. He loves you too much to leave you where you are. And I love you too much to stay silent. I'm Julian Hayes. I died. I saw eternity. And I came back to tell you that Jesus is the only way. Choose him while you still can.